Have you ever felt like something inside you reacts almost on its own? Like a part of you lashes out, gets defensive, or shuts down before your conscious mind even catches up? You're not broken. You're not crazy. You're meeting something deeper, something Carl Jung called the shadow. But here's the thing most people miss: the less aware you are of your shadow, the more power it has over you, the darker it becomes, the more it interferes with your life, silently, subtly, and sometimes explosively. Because when a flaw is conscious, you can work with it, you can face it, learn from it, even grow. But when it's buried deep, denied, and rejected, it waits in the dark, and it doesn't stay quiet forever. It shows up when you least expect it, in the tone of your voice, in the anger that doesn't match the moment, or in that familiar feeling of shame right after you said something you didn't mean. So the real danger isn't in being imperfect, it's in pretending we're not. Jung said, "The shadow that is not made conscious will be projected outside and appear as fate." In other words, if we don't turn inward and face the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore, those parts will find a way to act out, often through pain. And that is where the real work begins. Carl Jung didn't just speak about the shadow as one thing. He actually described two forms of it: the personal shadow and the collective shadow. Let's start with the personal shadow. Jung called it the thing a person has no wish to be. Think about that for a second. It's not just the obvious flaws we admit to, it's the parts of you that you hide, even from yourself. Maybe it's your jealousy, your anger, your selfishness, your cowardice, the traits that feel too uncomfortable to own, too painful to face. These parts don't just vanish because we deny them. They get pushed down, into the unconscious. But here's where it gets dangerous. When we repress them, we start projecting them onto other people. We say they're arrogant, they're manipulative, they're the problem, when in truth, it's a reflection of what we haven't faced in ourselves. And if you've ever snapped at someone for no good reason, or felt an intense reaction that didn't match the moment, you've seen your shadow in action. Now, some people are lucky or courageous enough to become aware of this shadow. They can see it rising. They know when it's speaking. And when that happens, the ego still has a chance to step in. But most people, they stay unaware. They repress so deeply that the ego doesn't even know the shadow exists. And in that darkness, the shadow gains a life of its own. It leaks out in sudden irritation, strange moods, even cruelty. That's why Jung insisted. Becoming aware of your shadow isn't optional. It's essential, especially in therapy. Because if you— Here's something you might not expect. Not everything in your shadow is ugly. We often think of the shadow as something purely negative, something dark we need to fix or avoid. But Jung saw something deeper. He wrote that the shadow can also carry positive qualities, qualities we've disowned, not because they're evil, but because they didn't feel acceptable. See, sometimes the parts of ourselves we suppress are not weaknesses at all. They're strengths we were never allowed to own. Maybe you grew up thinking that being assertive made you rude, so you learned to stay quiet. Maybe your creativity was mocked, so you buried it. Over time, you start to believe that confidence is arrogance, that ambition is selfishness, that desire is shameful. And that's how the shadow grows. Not just from our flaws, but from our potential, from everything that could have made us whole, if only we had the courage to embrace it. Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators, said it beautifully. The shadow is not always an opponent. He becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. In other words, when we pretend those parts of ourselves don't exist, they don't disappear, they push back harder. So how does the shadow reveal itself when we're not paying attention? One of the most mysterious ways is through our dreams. Jung noticed that the shadow often shows up in our sleep as a same sex figure, someone who criticizes us, calls us out, confronts us with something uncomfortable. That dream figure is your unconscious mind trying to hand you a mirror. And here's the twist: the criticism isn't meant to shame you, it's meant to wake you up. Because the parts you deny, they don't die, they wait. And if you ignore them too long, they'll show up at your job, in your relationships, in your silence. And you won't even know why you feel so stuck. So, what do we do with the shadow? How do we stop it from running the show behind the scenes? That's where shadow work comes in. And no, it's not some mystical ritual or self help buzzword. It's the deep, often uncomfortable process of becoming radically honest with yourself. It's when you stop avoiding your emotional reactions and start asking, why did I react that way? What part of me just got triggered? Shadow work means turning inward and facing the parts of yourself you usually run from. It's recognizing patterns like shutting down in conflict, people-pleasing when you're angry, or lashing out when you feel small. And it's asking, where did that come from? Whose voice is that in my head? Sometimes the answers come in moments of reflection. Sometimes they show up in dreams. And sometimes they hit you like a truth you weren't ready to hear, but desperately needed. Now, here's the key. The goal of this process, it's not about becoming impressive. It's about becoming real. But here's the hard truth. Most people will never do this work. Not because they can't, but because it's hard. Because it requires humility. It requires sitting with discomfort. And it forces you to let go of the polished image you've built for the world. And sometimes even for yourself. But for those who are willing, for those brave enough to face the shadows within, something changes. The chaos begins to quiet. The self-sabotage loses its grip. And slowly, we become more than just a collection of reactions. We become conscious. Now, let's zoom out from the individual to the collective. Jung didn't just speak about personal shadows. He also warned us about something far more dangerous: the collective shadow. The hidden, repressed darkness of an entire society. Think about it. Just like individuals push away their unwanted traits, societies do the same. The collective shadow shows up as racism, war, oppression, cultural erasure, poverty, exploitation. It's the darkness we project onto entire groups, calling them less than, dangerous, other. And here's the haunting part. These patterns don't just come and go, they're passed down. Trauma lives in the body, yes, but it also lives in culture, in language, in silence. And unless we face it, it festers. It shapes how we raise our children, how we build systems, how we decide who deserves to be heard and who gets ignored. Jung believed this collective shadow is what we've historically labeled as evil. In Christian tradition, it's what was called the devil, a force so dark it strips people of their humanity. And once someone becomes possessed by that collective darkness, they're capable of things they never thought possible. You only need to look at history. Nazi Germany, genocides, slavery, to see what happens when the collective shadow is denied, ignored, and allowed to grow. People don't just become cruel overnight. They fall, one step at a time, into something they believe is justified, until it's too late. That's why Jung insisted, the first step to healing is not blaming others, but owning the darkness within. Because without that awareness, we don't just become victims of the collective shadow, we become participants in it. So the real question is, what shadows are we still denying as a culture today? So here's the question we have to ask ourselves. Here's is the type of races weather your face. C is having truths. What do we do with a dark history that's still shaping the present? You see, when it comes to the collective shadow, the pain a society has inflicted, ignored, or denied, Carl Jung taught that what we suppress doesn't disappear. It returns, stronger, angrier, more destructive. And that's exactly what happens when a culture refuses to face its own shadow. The trauma doesn't just fade, it festers beneath the surface, passed from one generation to the next. You might have seen nations try to reckon with this through public apologies, reparations, or ceremonies of remembrance. And while those symbolic gestures matter, they're not enough on their own. Because real healing doesn't happen at the surface. It happens in the collective soul, in how honestly we're willing to remember, speak, and sit with the pain that's still alive. This means facing what's often unspeakable: genocide, slavery, mass oppression, systemic violence. It means allowing both victims and perpetrators, along with their descendants, to voice the pain, the guilt, the rage, the grief, and letting it be heard. Jung believed that only through this process does the collective shadow lose its grip, that when truth is spoken, truly spoken, it liberates. It opens the door for genuine reconciliation. So ask yourself, is your culture remembering honestly, or just performing remorse? So, after all of this, what can you do? When we talk about something as massive as war, injustice, or historical trauma, it's easy to feel powerless, like these shadows belong only to governments, leaders, or history books. But Jung's message was the opposite. Collective healing begins with personal integration. Because here's the truth: when you refuse to face your own inner shadow, you're more likely to unconsciously feed the collective one. You stay reactive. You project your fears. You judge others for what you haven't yet reconciled in yourself. And slowly, without even knowing it, you become part of the very darkness you claim to stand against. But when one person does the inner work, when one soul steps forward with honesty and humility, it has ripple effects. It brings clarity to the confusion, light to the denial, courage to the silence. Jung once said, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakes." When you face your own capacity for both good and harm, you no longer walk the world blindly. You become a mirror that doesn't distort. And in a world drowning in projection, that kind of self-awareness is radical. So yes, confronting your shadow may feel small compared to the weight of collective suffering, but it's not. Because every time you take responsibility for your darkness, you free others from having to carry it for you. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the real healing begins. So, where do we begin? We begin where all transformation begins, with the self. Before we try to fix the world, we have to confront the parts of us we've been avoiding. That's shadow work. It's not glamorous. When you begin facing your personal shadow, your hidden anger, your envy, your insecurity, you stop being a prisoner of it. You stop projecting it onto others. And as you reclaim the parts of you that you've denied, something incredible happens. You become whole. But it doesn't end there, because once you've walked through your own darkness, you start to see the world more clearly. The systems, the stories, the silence. That's when the real responsibility begins. To acknowledge not just personal wounds, but collective ones. And to speak truth, even when it's painful. Carl Jung said, "There is no light without shadow, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. To seek perfection is to chase a mask, but to seek wholeness, that's where healing lives." Truth is what keeps history from repeating. Denial only deepens the shadow. But when you face it, First inside, then outside, you break the cycle. You interrupt the inheritance of silence. And in doing so, you don't just change yourself, you change the future.